Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mary Lesher. I'm the Programs Manager at Dumbarton House, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the latest installment of the Black Georgetown Community History Project. Today we are talking about oral history. The Black Georgetown Community History Project is a partnership with Dumbarton House, Mount Zion Female Union Band Society Historic Memorial Park, Georgetown Heritage, and Tudor Place Historic House and Garden. This series is funded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Today, we're joined by Anna Kaplan. Anna is a PhD, she's a doctor, is a scholar and oral historian in Washington, D.C. She is the Vice President of the Board for Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region and a co-chair of the Oral History Association's Diversity Committee. She has worked on projects with the National Park Service, the D.C. Oral History Collaborative, several Smithsonian Institution museums, and the U.S. Golf Association Museum. She is an adjunct professor and resident public historian at the University of the District of Columbia and at American University. She earned her PhD in history at American University and MAs in oral history and anthropology at Columbia University. We are also joined today by Vernon Ricks, who is a third-generation Washingtonian and a Georgetowner. Mr. Ricks graduated from McKinley Tech High School, and he worked for the Xerox Corporation for 33 years. He has been involved with the Mount Zion United Methodist Church in Georgetown for many years, and we're so excited to hear about his memories of Georgetown and Washington today through our oral history. So I'm going to pass it over to Anna, who's going to give us a presentation about oral history, and then we're going to listen to a conversation between Anna and Vernon to show us some of the skills that are used in oral history. So thank you so much for being here today. Anna?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to everyone about oral history. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the entire process of oral history. So I'll start out with a little exploration of what oral history is, and then take you through the steps of preparing for and conducting an oral history interview. And then we'll dive into some of the elements involved in doing post-interview documentation and preservation before talking about a few ways to use oral histories and where to find them. And then I'll have a list of additional resources that we can also share with everyone after the session. So everyone usually thinks of oral history as just a conversation, and it is, but it also involves a lot more planning, and it requires a lot more work after that conversation is done in order to make sure that the conversation is preserved and it's shared and continues to have value even after the interview is over. So what is oral history? I like to start with this quote from Nepia Mahuika, and he wrote, quote, "For many indigenous communities, oral history is inextricably connected to identity. It is a collective enterprise essential to cultural survival, naming the world, asserting power and belonging, and narrating relationships across time and space to land, sea, sky, and each other." And I think his definition of oral history is very powerful because it reminds us that oral history is a tradition. It's been practiced for a long time by many people, by many communities, particularly those who don't have a text-based history or a text-based way of documenting and passing on their history and their way of understanding the world. I think it's also important because it reminds us that when we record oral histories, we're not just recording the story itself, but we're also recording some culture. We're recording the way people tell stories. And this is a practice that a lot of people have learned from other people, either in their family or in their communities. And so thinking of oral history in this much broader perspective. So the Oral History Association is the professional organization for oral history in the United States. And they have their own particular definition of what oral history is. So for them, oral history refers to both the interview process and the products that result from a recorded, spoken, or signed interview. So these are interviews that can focus on the narrator's life history, so a particular person's own story of their life and how it has sort of the trajectory it's taken. It can also focus on a subject or event about which the narrator has a lot of knowledge. So really focusing on, for example, the history of Georgetown, because the narrator has a lot of experience or knowledge about the history of Georgetown. The Oral History Association also emphasizes that oral history helps place people's experiences within a larger social and historical context. So this is important because we're not just capturing one person's memories, but we're using those memories to try and understand what's going on in the world at that time, what's going on in the social world, in the historical world, and how different people interact with those events, how they navigate them, how they influence them on their own. So oral history can help document past events, it can help document individual or collective experiences, and it can also help document understandings of the ways in which history is constructed, the way that we understand the past and pass on those that understanding to future generations. Oral history is particular because it captures these memories and recollections about the past, filtered through the lens of a changing personal and social context. Every oral history interview is different, even if that person, the narrator, has been interviewed multiple times. Each time it's different because it's being told in the present, and the present is constantly changing. So someone telling the same stories under the presidency of Barack Obama might tell that story in a different way than if they were telling it under the presidency of Donald Trump. So these are that's kind of an extreme example, but these are ways in which the present context in which the stories are being told can influence the way that people tell them. It also can change based on who the narrator is talking to. So oral history is very much a dynamic and collaborative relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. So very much about this relationship, this dynamic between two people. And that can change depending on who the interviewer is. It also is why every interview is different, because if you do it with different narrators, no two people are the same. So every interview is a little bit different and requires some different approaches. The interviewers can structure the interview through posing questions and directing the interview in different ways, but the narrator shapes the interview based on what they see to be relevant, meaningful, or appropriate to share in that moment and with that person. So preparing for an oral history interview, the first thing, of course, is to invite the person you want to interview to do an oral history. You have to explain what it is, how long it may take, what the process is, what the plan is for preserving it or using it later. If there is a legal release form that needs to be used, talking about it with the narrator before the interview takes place, but they'll sign it later. Just having this open and honest conversation about what an oral history is. Then you need to choose the recording technology. And this is something that is important for the lifetime, the longevity of the oral history recording. Archival quality digital audio files are broadcast wave file format with a sample rate of at least 48 kilohertz and a bit depth of at least 16 bits, preferably 24 bits. And this may seem like gobbledygook, but a lot of digital audio recorders today are set to record to these specifications. This shouldn't mean that if you aren't able to access technology to record at this level, that you shouldn't do oral histories. Oral history is a balancing act between making sure that you preserve this really important history, these really important stories, and trying to make that file that you're creating the highest quality possible. So maybe you get there, maybe you don't, but that's okay, because it means that collecting this history is possible. So really trying to think about oral histories as both the form and the content. That just because the recording that you are making is top quality doesn't mean that the content of the interview is good. And just because the content of the interview is stellar, it doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily a high quality audio recording. So these are two different things that you sort of have to balance or juggle in the process of doing an oral history. So choosing recording technology. There are different possibilities for in-person recording versus remote recording. But some of the questions for deciding what to use are the same. So first of all, is it accessible? Does it fit within your budget? Does it, especially for remote options, does it require other devices? Are those devices available to you? Are they available to the narrator so you can both participate in this recording? Do you know how to operate it? Are you comfortable learning how to operate it? If it's remote recording and the narrator has to operate some of it on their end, are they able to operate it, or are they able to get assistance from someone else to help them operate it in order to participate in the session? Can it record a high quality file? Is the file going to be audio or is it going to be video? Do you need it to be both? That's a great question to think about beforehand. Also, particularly for in-person interviews, does the recorder have a power source? If you're recording on your smartphone, for example, make sure you can plug it in and that the power will last the entire interview. You don't want the recorder to cut out in the middle of the interview and then you lose half of the interview because it's no longer recording. Also, particularly if it's a remote interview and you're conducting it online, does the platform provide a secure or private session if the narrator needs that? So what is the level of security that using online platforms may or may not be able to support that your narrator needs in order to feel comfortable sharing their stories in that particular situation? And then lastly, of course, can you transfer the file after the interview? Again, it's no use doing an interview if you can't get the file later. If you can't download it or transfer it off of the machine, then it's inaccessible, and that would be heartbreaking. So preparing for the oral history interview, you've invited the person to the interview, you've selected your recording technology that's accessible to you and accessible to the narrator. And then the next step is doing research. If you are able to research the person who you're interviewing, that's great. But oftentimes there isn't a lot of information on those people, and that's why we're doing the interviews, in order to find out more about them. But you can do research around them. So you can research the communities that they were part of, some of the places, the events, historical themes or experiences that you might want to ask them about. And the reason why you do this research is so that you can identify things that they might mention that you want to follow up on. That you want them to explain the significance and the stories about these places and people and experiences that they've had. But you want to be able to pick up on names or places that they might just sort of casually drop into their stories, but you want to follow up on and ask them more questions about. And to help you kind of organize all of this and practice before the interview, you'll want to create an interview guide. And the purpose of this interview guide is to state your objective for the interview. So putting out a clear statement of what you're hoping to learn in the interview. Also giving a paragraph or two of background information on the narrator as the helpful context for why you're doing the interview, what you're hoping to learn. And then you'll want to write out possible questions, and you practice writing out the full question in order to really think deeply about how you're wording the questions, which questions you're asking in order to get specific information. And then also group those questions by themes and organize them into a possible flow for the interview. Remember that the interview guide is for you as the interviewer. It is not for the narrator. So you definitely want to share themes with the narrator so they can feel prepared and maybe think about stories they want to share ahead of time, start jogging their memory. But you don't want to share the actual questions with them because you don't want them to get stuck on questions that maybe you listed and didn't ask, or if you asked questions in the interview that weren't on your list in the interview guide, and then they feel taken by surprise. So really remember that the interview guide is for you, and that the themes are what you share with the narrator. And I have an example for you as well. So this is an example interview guide. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing. I'm not expecting you to read the whole thing. But this is just to give you an example where you can see that Crystal and Dave, in preparing for their interview, they wrote out almost 3 pages of questions, and they have them sort of organized into themes. So for this particular interview, they have the theme of this person's life before coming to the United States, their life in Seoul, South Korea, what it was like to immigrate to the United States, also the theme of DC Asian food communities, what it's like to have specific cuisines or specific restaurants that they work in. But before all of that, they also preface it with why this person is important to interview, what particular special knowledge they can share, and what they're trying to get out of the interview. For example, at the very end of the second paragraph, it says, I also hope to understand how the globalization of Korean culture, known as Korean Wave, shapes the livelihoods of transnational subjects. So really thinking about what might be some of the ways that this interview might be able to tell a much larger story, even though it's rooted in a particular person's experiences. So conducting an oral history interview, this is probably the part that everyone gets the most excited about. You want to make sure that at the beginning you record a lead, and the lead includes the names of everyone in the room, particularly the interviewer and the narrator. You also want to record the date, the location in which the interview is happening, and a short statement of the purpose of the interview. And this is to give the interview some context in case the recording gets separated from its other materials that provide that context. You also want to make sure that you record verbal permission to do the recording. And this, again, is just a backup form of getting permission from the narrator to record the interview that's about to happen. Then during the interview, the most important thing is to be curious and ask questions. You want to try and ask open-ended questions. So a lot of these might be worded as, tell me about, or can you describe, or what is the story about? And these are questions in which the narrator is basically presented with a topic that you want to know more about, and they can take it in whatever direction they want to take it in. Sometimes they'll surprise you and answer you in ways that you had no idea they were going to answer it. But you don't want to lead them to a specific answer, and you don't want to ask too many questions that have short answers. So some of these might be necessary in terms of asking them, can you tell me what school you went to? And they'll give you the name, and that's really important because that's something you can research later on or use in different projects. But you also want to ask the open-ended question of, tell me about school. What did you like in school? What did you not like in school? Describe your teachers to me. So you want to really sort of ask some of those questions that get specific information, but then also ask these broader questions that are inviting the narrator to really explore and share their experiences with you. Also ask for descriptions, stories, and examples, and these really bring the oral history to life. You also want to make sure that you don't assume or skip over quote unquote insider knowledge. So they might talk about something that you know and that they know. Maybe they talk about a school or a park or a specific history that is kind of common knowledge between the two of you, but you want to ask them to explain that. You want to ask them to describe those places, and that's thinking about people who might be using this interview in the future and who may not have that knowledge. It's the same for terms, especially words like feminism or gentrification, where we all kind of know what it means, but we can all have different perspectives on what those words mean. And so it's great to ask narrators to explain what they mean when they use these words. You also want to follow the narrator's lead. So you want the interview to accomplish your goals and to get the information that you're looking for, but at the same time, you want to follow where the narrator leads. So if they take you down this portion of their memory that you weren't expecting, then go with them. Ask them follow-up questions. Again, don't stick to the list of questions that you created as if it's a script. Use it as a guide, as something that might help you as a tool in your tool belt, but really using your curiosity and exploring with the narrator where they take you in their story. And again, part of this is really listening deeply to what they're saying so that you can respond to what they say, and also being silent, of letting some awkward pauses be in the interview and have the narrator be the one who wants to fill that silence with another story instead of you jumping in automatically with another question. And then, of course, the last question should always be a very open-ended question that allows the narrator to share anything else with you. So you might phrase this question as, is there anything you wanted to share but didn't? Is there anything you wish I had asked about? Or is there anything else you wanted to add? And this just lets the narrator put some final thoughts out there. And sometimes they'll provide information that you didn't even think to ask about. And that can be great for using in interviews that you do with someone else about that same topic. So just as an example, here's a little excerpt from the interview of Neville Waters III, interviewed by Samantha Harrell in 2018. And this is part of the Citizens Association of Georgetown Oral History Collection. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just wanted to point out a couple places where Samantha did some really great demonstrations of how to conduct an oral history interview. So she starts out with this broad sort of prompt saying, you grew up here as a kid, sort of prompting Neville to respond with this explanation of what the neighborhood was like, what it was like when he was a kid, and to go into some stories. And as he's telling these stories, he mentions Rose Park. He doesn't really describe what it is, but he mentions it was there, that he played in it sometimes. And then he goes on to talk about some other stories. But you can see later on, Samantha brings it up. So Rose Park kind of turned on a light bulb in her head, and she knew that she needed to follow up and ask about that later. So later she follows up and asks, what was Rose Park like? Now, this question may have been on page 3 of her interview guide, but she knew because Neville brought it up that she should go ahead and ask it now. Another great thing that she did is that Neville, at the end of one of his descriptions, says that people were moving all over the block, and he was saying from 28th and P to the corner of 28th and O, okay, all over the block. And then Samantha repeats, okay, all over a block. And this is a great way for her to demonstrate that she is involved and she is listening. She's very much paying attention to and participating in these memories that Neville is sharing with her. This repetition also encourages him to continue his description, continue his story without her having to ask further questions. So you did an interview, you had a great conversation. Now what? That's not the end. If there are legal release forms or archival donation forms to sign, have the narrator sign them after the interview is over so that they know the stories that they are agreeing to share or to donate to an archive. Also make sure that the narrator keeps a copy for their own records of that release form or donation form. You'll also need to transcribe the interview. If you have someone else transcribe it for you or an automated service transcribe it for you, make sure you audit edit it in order to check for mistakes. And then give a copy of the recording and the transcript to the narrator for them to keep. If nothing else, part of what they're getting out of this experience is a record and a copy of their stories that they can share with their family or with their friends. For yourself, you should take notes and reflections on the interview, what went well, what you could have done better, and this will help you grow as an oral historian and help your interviewing practice evolve. And then you can create something with the oral history interview, something to help share it with other people and create something new out of it. The life of an oral history doesn't have to stop with its preservation. It can continue going in how it is shared and how it is remade into other things, which I'll give some examples with in a minute. So just a few notes about long-term preservation. You'll need to decide if the interview is going to be kept in a personal archive and or if it's going to be donated to another archive. This is a decision that you'll need to make with the narrator. The important thing about oral history is that the narrator keeps agency and control over their own stories. Oral historians recognize that while we are part of the process of creating this oral history, that the person who really makes all the decisions is the narrator because these are their stories and their experiences. If you are keeping an oral history in your personal archives, you want to make sure that there are multiple copies kept in multiple locations. And this is in case anything should happen in one location, there's another copy somewhere else. For physical copies, you want to keep them stored in a stable environment, ideally someplace that is cool, dark, and has low humidity so that the physical materials on which the file is stored degrade at a much slower rate. For digital copies, you'll want to make sure that more than one person has access to wherever they're stored. Particularly if they are password protected, you'll want to make sure that someone else can access or knows that password in case something happens to you. And you want to make sure that that digital copy is accessible afterward. You also want to make sure that you update your files and the technology regularly. If it's a digital file, you want to open it and resave it so that you can make sure that as software gets updated, the files are updated along with it and continue to be read or played. If they are stored on a physical object, such as a cassette tape or a CD, you want to make sure that you also have the device that's required to play the recording. A cassette tape or CD doesn't do you any good if there's no way to play it. So really think about that when you're thinking about which types of technology to use to store oral histories long-term. So a few examples of ways to use oral history. One is exhibits online or in person. The Whitman Walker recently did a fantastic exhibit celebrating their 40th anniversary with stories that they curated and put up on their website. Ola Cultura did a walking tour of Adams Morgan, and this relied heavily on oral histories and allowed people to listen to clips of oral histories as they were walking through Adams Morgan. Another example, of course, is podcasts. That's a big thing right now, and oral histories are a prime source to get materials in order to do a podcast, to have other people's voices in conversation on a podcast episode. And similar to that are documentaries. So Block, the Brooklyn Literary and Hunting Club, is a prime example of a documentary about this organization, this group of friends, documenting their history through oral history, and also providing a visual element along with it. So where can you find oral histories, particularly ones about DC? There is a great interactive map that was created with support from the DC Oral History Collaborative and Humanities DC. It's accessible on the DC History Center's website, and it is a map of all of these different places that there are oral histories about, and you can click on each of those little circles and it'll tell you where and how you can access that oral history. The DC Public Library's online collection, Dig DC, is also a great place where you can find oral history collections. There are also some neighborhood collections across the city. So of course, the Citizens Association of Georgetown, Chevy Chase Historical Society, the Ruth Ann Overbeck Capitol Hill History Project, and then the AU Humanities Truck also has a lot of collections of oral histories about DC. And then finally, here are some resources. Ask Doug is a great resource for helping you make decisions about how to choose a digital audio recorder, both that work in your budget, but also fit your needs for what you want to do with the interview afterward. The Oral History Association and Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region, as well as the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress, are great places to get more resources about oral history. The DC Oral History Collaborative offers more in-depth workshops about doing oral history. And if you complete their workshop, you can check out digital audio recorders from them. And then finally, the DC Public Library Studio Lab at the MLK branch has a studio set up where you can do video or audio recordings in their spaces that are soundproof and professional quality. So we'll share these additional resources with you after today's program, but hopefully this gets everyone sort of excited and pointed in the right direction of how to start and think about your oral history projects.
Well, thank you. That was great. I certainly took a lot of notes and learned a lot. I do have a few questions in the Q&A. Did you and Vernon want to get started? Or do you want me to throw out a couple questions first?
Either way. Vernon, do you have a preference?
Either way. I'm flexible.
All right, well, why don't we let the two of you guys take center stage, and then we've got some great questions coming in Q&A, so everyone can continue to put them in chat or the Q&A, and we'll let Vernon and Anna go ahead.
Great. So just as a demonstration of great oral history process, I am going to introduce this session, this conversation with Vernon. Today is April 16th, 2021. I am Anna Kaplan. Vernon, will you introduce yourself?
I am Vernon H. Ricks, Jr., and I am I lived in Georgetown. I was born in Georgetown, and I still travel to Georgetown very, very often because I go to church there, and I'm the chairman of the board of trustees there, and so that keeps me busy in Georgetown.
Excellent. Can you tell me a little bit about how your family originally came to Georgetown?
Well, my mom and dad, they were lived in DC. They lived in DC. They went to schools in DC. And my mom lived over in the Ivy City area of the city, and my dad lived right in near Logan Circle area of the city. Once they were married, and they had two little girls first, and then they moved to Georgetown. And I think that was, well, when I was born there and lived there afterwards. But they moved to Georgetown, and that's where they settled for a portion of the time.
Can you describe that first house or apartment that you lived in that you remember?
Absolutely. The address was 1404 26th Street Northwest, and we lived in apartment 4. That is a garden style apartments, and they're still there. Of course, we probably could not afford it now. It was a 1-bedroom apartment, you know, mom and dad, that's what they probably could afford then. It had, if I can remember, we had a living room, and in the living room is where my sisters would sleep. You know, they had a pull-out couch, I guess it was, and I slept in the bedroom with my mom and dad. And I had the little baby bed at first, I guess, and then I graduated to have my own little cot-like bed. And we had a kitchen, and they were very nice apartments, and the buildings, were fired by coal then. You know, they had coal furnaces, and the in between two buildings, it was 1404, and I can't remember the address of the one next to it, probably a couple of doors, like 1406 or 8, something like that. And in the middle, there was a courtyard. And in that courtyard is where the tenants of the building would hang out their laundry and what have you. In each building, at least in my building, there were 4 or 5 apartments. And we were on the 2nd floor. And we faced Rose Park Playground. And so we got a chance to look out the window all the time and see what was going on out in the neighborhood.
Will you tell me a story about one of your happiest memories in that apartment?
Well, in the apartment, there were, of course, back in that day, kids living with their parents. And so we had enough kids in the 2 buildings and around the corner that on rainy days, I mean, there was no staying in or what have you. One of the worst punishments you could get was if mom was punishing you and you had to look out the window at all the kids out there playing, and you couldn't go out to play. And so the memories were so great of when anybody had a birthday, you got to go to the birthday party. There was always a birthday party or something around in that complex that you got to have a good time. And even if you were not invited, you were invited. You invited yourself to the neighborhood parties. And so it was great memories. It was a village, and we really had the camaraderie of ourselves with all of our friends as we grew up together.
You mentioned that it was a village, or it felt like a village. Can you describe some of the main people who were important people in that village for you?
Right. Well, let me go and say that Georgetown, Black Georgetown was a village. And let me describe what I call Black Georgetown from P Street or over at the Rock Creek Parkway, up and Q Street on the north, probably K Street on the south, and all the way up to the university, Georgetown University on the west. And past Wisconsin Avenue, there were some Blacks living up there, but not as many as between the Rock Creek Parkway and Q Street, say 30th Street and M Street, in that area. And when I say that it was a village, because every parent in that vicinity or in Georgetown was your parent. And you were raised by all of them in a sense. You were corrected by any without any problem with them and your parents. In fact, your parents cheered them on. There was a communications network, none other really. Like today we have cell phones. Today we had mama cells. Mama cells were, your mom would pass the word, it would come down. You don't know how it got there before you did. It ran faster. It was 5G. It moved fast. The word moved faster than any word on everything that you did. And so, most of the men in the neighborhood worked, during the day and all. And a lot of the mothers were either domestic workers or they, were house moms. Our village, the centerfold of our village was Rose Park Playground. That's where all the kids would gather. That's where, most of the activities, that and the churches, the Black churches, there were, I think, 5 Black churches in Georgetown. And so that village raised every child. And the children were accountable to every parent and every adult in the community. And so they knew us and we knew them, and we knew who were the strict ones and who were the less strict ones. And so it was a great raising of young people.
Can you describe one or two of the people in the village who really stick out in your mind?
Yes. Well, in the village and I'll go back to my birth because the doctor who sanctioned my birth and made sure I was in and safe and cuddled up was Dr. C. Herbert Marshall. He was a very prominent doctor in the neighborhood. There were school teachers. I remember on P Street, there was my first grade teacher, Miss Andrews, I think her name was there. We had the pastors. Right next to our apartment complex was Jerusalem Baptist Church. And so, that was there. Then we had the, if I can remember her name, Miss Prince, who was the director at the Rose Park Playground. And so those were just some of the people, teachers, ministers, doctors, and Dr. Dotson, who lived on P Street also. those were some of the more prominent people. But then you had those who were not as prominent in the community, but they were still there and they still had a part in managing, I call it managing the village.
That's great. You mentioned that there were, I think you said 5 different Black churches.
Right.
How did they sort of interact with each other? What was that relationship like?
Well, fortunate enough, it was enough people to fill them all. I look back at pictures of, and I'm the chairman of the board of trustees at Mount Zion. Mount Zion is the oldest traditional African-American church in the city, in DC. And I look back at pictures back then of the person, people coming to the churches, and the churches were packed. Our church had has a balcony and all, and I mean, the downstairs and the upstairs were packed. The churches interacted very well. Jerusalem was, like I said, right a couple of doors from my house. Mount Zion was a little further up 29th and O Street. There was First Baptist, which was at 27th and Dumbarton Avenue. And then there was the Epiphany, which was on Dumbarton Avenue. And then there was one, Alexandria Memorial, which was on N Street. And one of the things that would happen is during the summer, we would have vacation Bible school. And sometimes you went to 4 or 5 vacation Bible schools, one right after the other. Mom and dad would farm you out, you going to Bible school. And it was great because, we got a chance to do things. We'd make things, we would, and I went to nursery school at First Baptist. Mount Zion was established in 1816. Of course, I was not the chairman of the board of trustees then. But that by being the oldest church, a lot of times, a lot of the activities were coordinated for us through them. And all of the kids in the neighborhood went to somebody's church mostly. Sunday was church day. Sunday morning was Sunday school. Sunday afternoon was, Sunday, morning also was regular church. And then we would come back to church for youth programs in the evening and what have you. And so again, along with the program, with the playground and the recreation center there, the churches were some of the focus and center of the culture of the Black community in Georgetown. And most of the kids participated one way or the other, and we went, just because you were, say, Methodist, didn't mean you didn't go to things at the Catholic church or the Baptist church. To us, it was just a church and a facility in our community.
And did anyone, when you were growing up, did you hear anyone talking about voting rights, particularly the right to vote in DC or anything like that?
Well, no, not in my young years. Not in my young years. As far as I remember, DC did not have a vote, period. So I did not, in my young years, I don't remember that conversation. See, one of the things back in the years, and I'm 82, so I'm talking about years from 1939 on. Kids were not in adult conversations. In other words, when there was an adult conversation, you found somewhere, your mom and dad found somewhere for you to go. And like those kinds of conversations were kind of adult conversations. And that's, excuse me, you were in school and, you know, you had some social studies or something like that. But no, we did not necessarily. Now, my mother was the secretary for the Civic Association. And Dr. Marshall, which I mentioned earlier, was his office, his home was across the street from where Neville lived. That they all lived along P Street there. But my mom was the secretary for the Civic Association, and Dr. Marshall was the president. My mom also was an air raid warden, because during the war, we would have to have, they would have air raid drills. And I can remember that people had black shades. And when the siren would sound, the people would pull the black shades down. And my mom had a helmet, and she would go out in the street to someplace, that was her assignment. But those kinds of civic things, unless they were displayed in that manner, then, as kids, they didn't really mean anything to us other than the excitement of the siren going off and the excitement, those kinds of civic displays.
Thank you. I want to keep an eye on the time and leave time for people to ask their questions. So I'm going to stop my questions here, but I wish I had more hours to talk to you about all of this. This is very fascinating.
Right.
But thank you for answering my questions.
Right. My history and thoughts of Georgetown are so extensive. The things that we did, and how we were able to interact with each other and just make that village work.
Thank you so much. And the first couple of questions are for you directly. So I'm going to throw them out to you, Vernon, and then I've got some oral history related questions as well. So either one of you can answer as we go through, except these first couple that came in the chat. What years were you living in Georgetown?
I was in Georgetown from 1939. That's when I was born, January of 39. And I won't say we were put out, we were moved out in a sense, because I was about 10, so that was about 1949 or 48, 49, somewhere we moved out of Georgetown. Georgetown was beginning to gentrify. And most of the people who did not own property, and there were a few along P Street who owned property. But of course, my parents were renters, and those were the first to kind of have to move on.
There's another question about the churches in Georgetown, since you live next door to a church, but then you are more involved with Mount Zion now. How did that happen? It kind of sounds like that was part of the community. You guys, there's a lot of cross-pollination. So.
Right. Well, my family on my father's side were from up in Quince Orchard, Maryland, which is up Gaithersburg area now. My great-great-grandfather was a Methodist pastor of a church up there, which is still a historic site up in Gaithersburg. My father and grandfather were both United Methodists, and my grandfather was a trustee at Asbury United Methodist Church at 11th and K. And so for some odd reason, my dad went to Asbury with his dad, and my aunts, the young ladies, went to the Baptist church with my grandmother. So when we moved to Georgetown, my mom, I guess, just took us to Mount Zion, and because of the United Methodist background. And that's where we matriculated through the church in the Methodist corridor. Yes.
Do you have, and I'm just pulling these out of chat and Q&A, so keep them coming. I really, these questions are great. Do you have thoughts about the decline of Black Georgetown and some of those causes?
Oh yes. Well, I'm still very concerned that the Georgetown community has grown to be out of reach for most African Americans. When you look at the prices and the way that they are redoing the housing, you're talking millions of dollars on houses, which is kind of out of the economic strata for the average African American. There are some who, still remain and were able to remain and can come in, but you can almost count them on one hand. When you look at the fact that because of the increase in the price of housing, the taxes can be so high that it can keep them out. And so to me, it is a strategy almost for removing African Americans from Georgetown. Now that sounds harsh, but when you look at the reality of who's there and who is not, you gotta take it for what you can see.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's very real and very intentional. Do former Black Georgetown residents have reunions, or have they in recent years?
They've had reunions. Dottie Harris, who is one whose family lived there in Georgetown, she had been pulling together the reunions. The last reunion of my age group was with Monica's, Rose's, her mom, Cynthia, her mom and her aunt and all. We had a little reunion, and we were able to bring together a lot of people who are in their, I'd say, late 70s or in their 70s and 80s now. But yes, we have had some, and Monica has been bringing us together to talk here recently between her and Neville, and so we've had that opportunity. But most of the people, like at our church and all the other churches and community venues around, don't live in Georgetown anymore, and so we travel to get there.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about the school you went to before you left Georgetown. If you could speak a little bit more about the school.
Oh yeah, Phillips School. Phillips was the elementary school from kindergarten to I think 5th grade, and then in 6th grade you went to Wormley, which the school is up near Georgetown University. The school community, and it was a square building. Now it's a condominium. And if I can describe it as a square building with 4 classrooms on each floor. And it was 2 stories, the second floor and the first floor. And then in the basement was the restrooms. Gosh, it's amazing how I can remember this so far back, but vividly see that. And in the middle of the 4, where the 4 classrooms were in the corners, 4 corners of the school, in the middle was a hallway, and that was the assembly hall. That's where teachers would bring kids out in to assembly, you know, for all the grades to meet. Then they would have May Day. It was a playground out back, and one of the big holidays or events that would happen at Phillips School was May the 1st, May Day. And the young people, y'all will not know about wrapping the maypole. It was a pole, it was a pole, I guess the pole was 10 or 12 feet tall, and it had streamers. And there was a method of wrapping this pole with these streamers, red, white, and blue, and what have you. And you had a May Queen, and you had all kinds of things that would happen in the community on May Day. One of my sisters was on several occasions with the May Queen, and that was another thing. You had a queen, they had floats, you had to, and with the May Queen, that was a big honor, and they had a crown for the May Queen and a cape and all of that. So it was a big event in the Black community. Of course, the schools were segregated. I went to Phillips until we moved out of Georgetown. And then I went to a school that in the Washington, D.C. area now, the area has become very popular, which is Adams Morgan area, because we lived up near DuPont Circle in that area. The schools were still segregated there. And so when I went to, that school is no longer there, but it was Morgan Elementary School. But Phillips, Phillips was right across the street from a big complex of kids who lived there. And it was just, you know, everybody walked to school. There was no school bus. There was no streetcar in the school. We walked to school. Didn't have to go, like most people say, I walked 5 miles to school. But the kids who went to Wormley, you know, in the 6th grade, they had to walk, you know, a good little distance up to Wormley School. But Phillips was the school. The building still remains. I understand, and it's condominiums now. And again, they're so priced out of the range of people that you won't see us there.
Did you walk both ways uphill in the snow to get to school?
Yes. Oh yeah. You need to make
both ways were
really hard, you know.
So many questions coming in. I'm going to ask a couple of more, and then there's some oral history questions that I'm going to put out there too. One about the other businesses in Georgetown, grocery stores, laundries, those kinds of businesses. What do you remember of those?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Georgetown was a village. And we had a drugstore, which was owned by a Black doctor, just went out of my mind. Anyway, it was the drugstore was right at 27th and P Street. We had a cleaners right there at 27th and P. We had a barber shop. We had a shoe shine parlor on P Street and most of these stores were between 26th and 27th Street. For groceries, there was 2 grocery stores that I can remember. One was Mr. Beek's store, which was at 26th and P. and the other was DGS, back then, District Grocery Store. You may have heard of that back in history. I don't think it's anymore around, but it was a painted orange store. And we could, that's where, you know, you got your local groceries. But then you had what I guess Amazon and all the other people are doing now. You had people who came through the neighborhood with horse and wagon. And there was we call him the huckster man. And the huckster man had a horse and wagon, and he had vegetables. And then there was the watermelon man that would come through singing watermelon, red to the rind, sweet as honey, and right off the vine. And then you had the good humor man who came through. For groceries, for big groceries, most people would go to what was called a sanitary. And that was over at 22nd and P Street. And then for real big grocery day, they would go down to the market on 7th and O Street in DC. And that's where you could get, pick a chicken out or a turkey out, and you go in the market and do the other market and come back, and chicken and turkey was ready to come home for the holidays. So that was mainly thing. And then we had beauty parlors. So everything was right there in the community. We go up on M Street to the 5 and 10 cent store. And I could go up there with a quarter and buy everybody in my family a Christmas present. You know, my sisters may get nickel, pay a nickel for a pair of earrings and stuff like that. But that was the commercial district in Georgetown.
That sounds really vibrant, really well descriptive too. I learned a lot. There's a comment that another someone who in attendance whose grandmother told him about the May Day celebrations as well in New Jersey, and a question if there was ever a May King or is it just May Queen?
Well, I don't. It may have been, but I don't remember the May King. You know, it was all it was the May Queen mostly. You know, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think this is the last one I'll have from the chat for now, and then I have a couple of oral history questions. But were the churches helpful, or were they able to do anything to help slow down or counter some of the decline of Black Georgetown as people were moved out, and since so much affordable housing was eliminated over the years?
Right. Well, the pastor at Mount Zion, who was Reverend J.D. Foy, he took on the campaign of fighting gentrification in Georgetown. He testified in courts and I think in Congress and what have you. And so, you know, in most cases, the churches were just trying to hold on to the parishioners and keep them coming to church. But yes, the churches did get involved in petitioning, because most people that they were moving out into Southeast or Southwest, or even pushing out into Prince George's County. And so it was, the churches did get involved, and, you know, there were petitions around and what have you. Yes.
I personally have learned quite a lot. Could keep listening to you talk about Georgetown and this great history. I am newer to oral history as someone who loves history, and this was a really wonderful introduction. My biggest takeaway is to not be too intimidated by the technology, that you can do something small, keep it for yourself, and really learn a lot from it. I've learned so much from today. This was really instructive to kind of learn how to get started in oral history. And so one of the questions that has come in is, what are some of the first steps that you would recommend to someone interested in collecting oral history, especially if they've never done it before?
That's a great question. Some of the things that I would suggest are listening to or reading transcripts of oral histories that have been done before, and just really picking up some tips and tricks that people do. Also finding examples of things that you don't want to do, that you want to try and stay away from when you do interviews. Those can be great sort of teaching tools, just learning to or listening to some of the oral histories that have been done before. Also, just practicing in everyday conversations. When I was learning oral history, I would go visit my grandmother, and I started practicing, how long can I keep my grandmother or her friends talking and telling me stories? I would do the same whenever I was like traveling on the train or flying, that I would strike up a conversation with someone next to me, which was terrifying because I'm an introvert. But I would strike up a conversation and see how long I could get that stranger to talk to me, and what kind of stories I could get them to share with me, as a way of exploring some of these tools and tricks for doing oral history. But then also, especially as you're getting comfortable with the recording equipment, I recommend starting out by interviewing family or friends. That's a great way to do a low stakes interview, that if you mess up, it's totally fine. Your family member hopefully will not hate you for it. They'll be willing to do a redo session with you if you need it. And it also records some of your own family or your friends' history. Oftentimes, even for oral historians, we interview everyone else except for our own family. And those are stories that we oftentimes lose. And so that's a great opportunity as you are building up your skills to capture those stories as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to start. You also have access to that person again, hopefully.
An easy rapport. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think one thing that I personally learned from you today is you are a very active listener. And I think that's a skill everyone could build, and that could aid them in recording oral histories and future topics of any kind. Yeah, it's a good life skill to have, is being an active listener and replying. A question about the oral history repositories in DC, of that helpful map that you sent, which is just a good reminder. We will send out some resources to everyone who registered after today. Is there a way to volunteer to contribute or get involved in the repositories that already exist?
Yes, there are a lot of repositories, and oral histories, as you might guess, have a lot of work that goes into archiving and preserving them. So a great way is to just start contacting repositories and asking them if you can volunteer in some way. And that might be audit editing interviews. It might be helping to get things online, and then just sort of working your way into, I'd like to do some interviews to help with this project. The DC Public Library is also a great repository for a lot of interviews. So if you are connected to different people in your own community, in your neighborhood, and you're thinking there needs to be an interview done with this particular person, then definitely start talking to DC Public Library about what their requirements are in order to accept oral histories. And then you can do your own oral histories and donate them to the DC Public Library to help build up that archive of DC stories.
And just kind of piggybacking off of that, how can people find things, maybe if they're not from the DC region, in other cities? What's like a good way to start looking for them there?
Absolutely. Historical societies are great places to start. You can also think about what sort of university libraries, because a lot of them have archives on local communities, local to the university. So university archives are a great place. And then also looking for historical institutions. And these are, historic houses or museums, and they oftentimes have their own archives and oral history programs. And they're always looking for more people to get involved and to help with the effort.
That's fantastic. And I personally have learned a lot. There's some things coming in chat and Q&A for you, Mr. Ricks, today on everything you shared. So thank you so much for that and your great answers. And I've learned a lot in watching you, the two of you model a conversation that could happen to really record. And just a reminder, we are recording this today. So if you wanted to go back and hear more of those stories again, you certainly can. My question is, what is the most surprising thing that either as being interviewed or interviewing that you have discovered, learned, or rediscovered in doing these type of oral histories?
Well, I'll say the one thing that I believe in very heartily is that oral history gives a truer aspect of the culture and what the person or the subject is about, rather than somebody just picking up something and start writing about something without having gotten to some of the people who lived the history. To me, oral history lived history. And in our community, in the Black community, it's probably not enough oral history out of people who lived certain venues. So I just think that it's the best venue is the oral history and a person who can interview well. And the questions, I think, they were not hard. I didn't have any butterflies or what have you. And I think for the two of us, the interaction was good. I could probably just ramble on and on and on about my life, but realizing that you have to keep the questions to a certain amount of time so you don't run the tape out.
For me, one of the things that was, I think, kind of surprising for me when I started was just how much oral history can teach you that you don't know. That you may go into a conversation thinking that you'll learn this certain information and it'll help you flesh out some of the history that you already know. But I think one of the exciting things is going into an interview and having someone introduce you to something that you weren't expecting at all and that you never would have known to ask for. And that was something that was surprising to me, of just how much I didn't know and how much oral history is just exploring, trying to find those little pockets of information and knowledge that I would not have known to look for going into the interview.
That's an interesting question, idea too, because I was wondering if there's anything that makes the post research really hard. Rose Park came up today. There were names that came up. I would be tempted, as not trained in doing oral history, to write down those things and then research those aspects. So is there something or aspects of the post interview research that can be difficult? I mean, I was thinking about people, places, and events that were mentioned today, and that to me seems like it could be really hard to track some of those things down sometimes.
Absolutely, and particularly because oral history oftentimes is history that is not well documented, and so it's people who may not be part of the records that already exist in archives, or places that have been torn down and weren't documented. And so I think that that's part of the power of oral history, is that doing one shows you just how much you need to do more in order to really get a sense of who those people were, what those places were, sort of what life was like at that time, what these experiences did for people, how they shaped people. That aren't in archives otherwise. So yes, it can be frustrating to have a list of names and places and try and go research them in an archive. But I think the great thing is knowing that you can always do another oral history interview, so that information that you're not finding in the archive, there are places, there are human beings who are archives, who you can ask a lot of that information from.
And an example of what people don't hear necessarily in other history is when you look at in Washington, in Georgetown especially, that there were people who lived in less than good facilities. They had outdoor facilities, and this was in as late as the 1940s and 50s. And so everybody who lived in Georgetown did not have a silver spoon. When you talk about people living in alleys today, you know, these are the places to live. But back in the day, when you talked about people living in alleys, that was some of the worst conditions for anyone to have to live in.
And that's a good reminder that sometimes in your interview, you're not just getting, you know, about hearing about maypoles and the May Queens, but also, right. Yeah, and that you going into it being prepared to learn things that can be hard and but should be preserved. Very
Right.
very
Absolutely.
Real important parts of our history that need to be talked about and preserved. A question about how you locate people for interviews, or how you would know how to find someone that needs who has these rich, wonderful stories.
Everyone has a story. So that's, you know, one
I was hoping
place
you would say that.
Yeah, that's one place to start, is just, you know, thinking as you're walking down the street, every person you're seeing, just being curious and thinking, I wonder what that person's story is, or, you know, I wonder what brought them to the neighborhood. But also really thinking about whose voices already exist in the archive, you know, who's already represented in the archive, and maybe who's not, and thinking about where you might be able to focus some of your efforts and your resources and time when you do oral histories, and thinking about how you might support a lot of these efforts to get some of these perspectives and this history that may not be as well known and documented and put into archives, made accessible to other people. A lot of it is just going out and building relationships in neighborhoods, or you know, again, volunteering, or creating some sort of relationship with a historical institution that already have connections to some of these neighborhoods and can help connect you with people. But a lot of it is just sort of going out, talking to people, oftentimes in your own neighborhood, just saying, okay, if you could interview one person, who would it be? And you might sort of, asking a lot of different people, you might come up with one or two names of really significant central people in that community or that neighborhood who might be some key people to make sure that you interview.
And I was just not reminded of a wonderful book called Black Georgetown Remembered, which has a 30th, I believe 30th anniversary coming out soon. So we'll pop into the chat information about that. And sometimes a lot of the questions today were very specific about Georgetown and Black Georgetown. And I think that that's an excellent book, an excellent place to start, to read a little bit about what's already out there and available at the library and through that book. I was also reminded that it would be a fantastic opportunity if Vernon mentioned Neville, so that's another, you can keep it rolling, go to the next person that you mentioned. Your interviewees may have mentioned people that you can continue to go to keep the project rolling and to learn more. I am going to give people just a moment to put any last questions into chat, especially if I missed them. We did pop in the link for Black Georgetown Remembered, which is a fantastic book. I hope those of you who are very particularly interested in Black Georgetown and the questions that were specific to that, I believe that would be a great resource for you as well. Lots of thanks for these memories that you shared today. I really, from me personally, and from the attendees that are here today.
I highly recommend that book. My picture's in there in some of the activities. And I just want to mention one other rite of passage that we had in Georgetown, and that was to go and climb the Carbon steps. you know, the steps right next to the car barn where they filmed The Exorcist. That was a rite of passage to go up, and you would like climbing up the monument. You know, that was a rite of passage.
Did you have to do that at night, or could you do it during the day?
No, we do it today. During the day, you know, that was a long way from home, so we would have to sneak out. You know, mom and them wouldn't know. You know, but you know, those kids who went up to Wormley, of course, they were right near. But sometimes the rest of us kids would get together, and that was a big thing to go and climb the steps next to the car barn.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. Those of you in Georgetown can go and try the step car barn exorcist step challenge. The challenge has been issued. I do not think I could do that. So I will bow out of that challenge. Well, thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, we'll put together some resources as well as the recording when it's ready, and we'll send it to everyone who was registered. So on behalf of our partners, thank you all so much for attending today. Thank you, Vernon. Thank you, Anna. I've learned so much, and I hope we can continue to work together and learn about Black Georgetown and preserving memories through oral history. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.